And what my hope to do today is to set the tone for this meeting and to talk about ways in which you can be leaders and will be leaders. And I think the best way to do that is to understand the context. Top-down management structures are viewed as losing their effectiveness in this world of turbulence today. Transparency and the idea of openness is coming, and networks are becoming what are important for organizations. And there's the intersection of baby boomer retirements, Gen X being a fairly small group, and millennials being a large group, which are going to put pressures on the workforce such that those of you who are millennials are going to, in many cases, assume responsibility much sooner than you might have. And there's a challenge in that, because generally perspective comes with experience. And what if you don't have a lot of experience? Well, one of the things I'm going to talk about right now and then return to at the end of my talk are what I call the 4 A's, which are characteristics of leaders that are worth following. Awareness that none of us has all the answers, that we don't know what we don't know. Active listening, a mind fearlessly kept open, or as a colleague of mine says, it's great to have strong opinions, just have them weakly held so that you might actually change your mind if you got more data. A lifetime learner from others, and as a result you become this leader that people are looking for. Now, having young people lead older people is not something new, but what's new is that there are some differences in today between younger and old in terms of what constitutes a good product, when is a quality work job done, what is leadership in the light of good teamwork, and finally, what's a leader who's worth following. So are these real differences? Should you care? That's some of the things that a leader has to ask. And with all this in mind, my objective is to set a tone of open-minded inquiry, constructive discussion where we talk to each other as colleagues and not necessarily in terms of rank or seniority. And so if you take my 4 A's that I mentioned, what ingredient is missing? Well, facts are missing. To be a leader, you have to be fact-based, as well as, and to be a teacher, you have to be fact-based. So I'm going to provide several things to hopefully get you started. I'm going to talk about 4 things that haven't changed, even though the economy has changed. I'm going to talk about some factors of what millennials think of, are beginning to say as leaders. But I think to start with, let's start with some definitions. These definitions are of the generations. This is first from a baby boomer's point of view. Let's define the generations, and there's nothing in concrete about the start and end dates of these generations. They're just directional. Veterans, traditionalists, or some call it the silent generation, their mantra from a baby boomer's point of view is work, work, work more if you ask me. I'll work even more even if you don't ask me. The next is the boomer. The boomer says work, work, work. That's what we're all about. Gen X, born between 65 and 1980. Work some more with flexibility. You want me to work any more? Let's talk. For millennials, it's a different story. Work flexibly anytime, anywhere on my terms. Want me to work any more? How lame is that? I just texted all my friends to tell them how lame you are. In fact, if we're lucky, I'll post it on Facebook and thousands will know how lame you are. So that's from a boomer's point of view, and I'm glad you laughed. Okay, because sometimes I presented this to millennial groups and there's been silence, and they said, one guy said, what's your point? So anyway, let's go on to, from a millennial's point of view, what about their grandparents? The veterans or traditionalists. My grandparents, who knows what they're thinking, but I guess they were hard workers. They were always nice to me. Boomers, who are their parents, work, 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 that's fine. You've achieved a lot, but ever consider the glass broken on the way to success? This can't be the only way. Gen X, well, they basically think millennials get all the attention. They say, what about me? And the millennials self-described flexible anywhere, anytime, on my terms, working even more. Don't you ever want to go home? They're directing this to the boomers. How about some balance here? I'm willing to work hard, but not harder, without regard to the impact of my life. Let's think of some alternatives of how to work. There's less humor in this one than the first one. But nonetheless, what do these particular definitions have in common? First off, they're cliches. And secondly, we need to discard them and learn to work together, because there are ways in which we are similar, and I'm going to talk about those in ways in which we are different. So let's talk about a window into my world. Coming to this meeting, I talked to some of my colleagues, and here's a synopsis of what some of them said. We're in the midst of an epic economic crisis. This is a quote. Why are we still talking about generational anything? Who cares what millennials want? Gen Xers or boomers for that matter. Another one said, you mean the Navy's sponsoring an entire conference on the topic of generational leadership in a time of crisis? Grump, grump, grump. Let's get our priorities straight. Everybody just has to hunker down and get to work. Well, I agree that everybody's got to hunker down and get to work, but we're going to talk about 4 things that have not changed, even though we're in some economic trouble. And I think these are very important, and I hope you'll note them and discuss them later as to whether you think they're true or not. But I think they're fact-based. The non-traditional family unit makes up the vast majority of households, and this is, I think, pretty important. To paraphrase the U.S. Census Bureau, there are 2 key attributes that define a traditional family. The people are married, one spouse works outside the home and the other does not. Now, this is a narrow definition, but in 1950, nearly 60% of family units met this narrow definition. Now, only 17% meet this definition. So what's it mean? Both people are working. Some people are single heads of household. There needs to be for flexibility for navigating work-life issues. Another thing is the workplace was designed for linear career paths, the expectation of total dedication to work. If you're expected to make any progress in your career, employees are expected to fit their lives into work rather than vice versa. So what's the next trend that's gone on here? Flexibility and career customization are necessities for workers now. This need for flexibility is enhanced by the fact that our research shows that both genders expect women to continue to have the primary role in child care and elder care. So since about 60% of college grads are females in the United States, there's a continuing pressure to customize careers and general flexibility. Workers, especially millennials, are redefining the place of work in life. We have some research that shows that a low percentage of millennials and Gen Xers who are willing to put work as the prime focus of their lives. We also have some data that shows that men are reporting spending 50% more time daily with their children than they did in the 1970s. And finally, I've had more than one of my peers say, I miss my child's games, I'm not going to miss my grandchild's. So in summary, the changes in the family structure which affect focus on work and demand for increased flexibility are upon us. Now, the first 3 things show that perhaps we're going to a different model. We call it at Deloitte the corporate lattice, where role, schedule, workload, and pace are varied. And that's the way that we feel that this will appeal to all generations. But fourth, and this is very key, there's a set of 3 interlocked realities that have huge impact on all of us. Technology, attitudes towards business, and a consumer mindset. Now, growing up as technology natives, most of you who are millennials and even Xers, has a profound changes expectations. What we found is that growing up with technology, people tend to say, judge me by my output, not how I got it or when I get it or when I got it to you. Just look at me in terms of my work and my work product. Technology permits a 24/7 connection to others, but especially to work. It encourages networks and lack of boundaries, which can be difficult for hierarchies to deal with. And at first, this difference looks like a generational one, but it's really an experiential one. Those of us who look at technology, and I'm one of them, as a tool or a toy, are different than those who have grown up with it, and it's sort of the very oxygen by which they operate. So these are important differences that we have. The next factor is the concern that people have about business, and this goes into any large organization, not just business. The view, a very skeptical view, which our research has shown, is that business is summarized by the following comment by a young lady in a focus group that I headed up. She said, we're looking to be loyal to an employer if that employer will be loyal to us, but we don't think business operates that way today. So growing up in a world of layoffs and corporate scandals and now a huge economic crisis has resulted in young people believing that businesses, and by translation any large organization, value their own financial gain above all else, and that their talk about the importance of people is largely insincere. These skeptical views are 67 to 75% of the 14 to 21-year-olds that we have looked at So one reaction to this is, who cares? They've got to work with us. They'll learn how the world is. But this is, you forget that uncommitted, skeptical people don't do very good work. And the young people we've interviewed have expressed a decided preference to work in smaller organizations or in smaller teams in large organizations because they believe they can have more control over their lives. So here's where organizations with real savvy can help themselves out by transcending the stereotype of large organizations, but it requires real leadership to do so. And before I talk about this final divide, I'd like to focus on the serious implications of having 2 out of every 3 young person highly skeptical of business or large organizations. What can be done about it? Well, we at Deloitte have come to realize that rebuilding the trust about business is something, or at least reducing the level of skepticism, is something that we have to do and take a lead in. So we've reached out to communities and especially schools. And one innovative program I wanted to mention to you, lest you think that we only know what the problems are but not the solutions, is what we call Life Inc. And this community outreach program is an example of outreach that helps students make the biggest decision in their lives with confidence by giving them young people tools for success. And we do that by using a book called Life Inc., The Ultimate Career Guide for Young People by Neil Godfrey, and it gives tips and tools about how to make these major decisions. We're hoping it leads to a more positive view of business, and the material is largely electronic. In fact, the U.S. Army Child, Youth, and School Services Group has adopted it for career education at its youth centers on bases. So some of you may say, what's this got to do with leadership? I think it has everything to do with leadership. Our research shows that young people are looking for reasons to be optimistic about business. They know they'll have to work for larger organizations and have told us they would look favorably on an organization that helped them make the biggest decision of their lives. That is, what are they going to do when they grow up? So giving these people, young people, the tools they need leads to a more positive view of business. And now the point about leadership. Leaders worth following understand the need to invest in the future just as others invested in them, recognize that long-lasting success comes from workers who, number one, believe that they're making the right decision every day by continuing to work at their job, and as a result are glad to help make organizations successful. Or as someone told me one time, you want to be in a position where others want to help you make money. So the effect of this consumer attitude, now we're going to go back here, talk about the consumer attitude mindset. We have raised people, particularly younger people, but it's starting to manifest itself in older people too, to be what we call engaged consumers. That's a euphemism for some people. We expect high quality, easy to handle, microwavable experiences. As one young lady described to me what she was looking for in service. This is the world in which the younger people were raised, and it's understandable they carry their expectations with them as they consume everything, including careers. The effect of consumer attitude is profound in us as leaders, and I'm going to give you 3 examples. The first is what I call the case of the manager besieged by subordinate questions. This is a true story. A friend of mine is an owner of a boutique software company. He was approached by his managers. Their complaint was, we can't get any work done because our junior staff are constantly interrupting us with questions. They won't work on their own, and that's why we've missed some deadlines. And the owner was very sympathetic and said, ladies and gentlemen, you are well paid to be interrupted. The job of a manager is to be interrupted. I don't want to hear about how young people aren't getting developed because you're not available to coach them. His point is that leaders worth following must be approachable and available, because how else can they be in touch with what's going on, and importantly, transfer knowledge. Our research shows that the more you prepare an employee to leave, the more they're likely to stay, because you're making an investment in them in something that they consider important, which is their career development. Next is the case of the senior professor challenged to justify your value. A very senior accounting professor came up to me with this story. She started her honors accounting class with what she thought was a simple request. Please tell us your hometown, your name, and what you hope to accomplish by taking this honors course. All went smoothly until the last student finished her introduction. The silence was deafening. Everyone stared at her as you're staring at me right now, and she said, "Are you waiting for me to say something?" One of the students says, "Well, yes. We'd now like you to tell us how you're qualified to teach us." Well, she was not pleased by this. And she said, well, she came to me and said, "This is awfully rude." And I said, "I would accept it from one point of view, it is rude, but these people were actually looking to sort of make sure that you were still in the game." And I suggested to her that there were 3 ways she could have reacted. One was to get angry, 2 was to ignore them, but the third one was to engage them in the following way. How do you respond when challenged to justify your value? My suggestion is say, that's a good question that we should all ask ourselves when we've done anything for a long time, including you. But most of all, let me tell you what I know. I know my material. I love teaching it. And I, for 25 years, have laid the groundwork for people like you to be successes in your careers. My point is to lay aside concerns about hierarchy and expectation of transparency, consumer mindset. They're both here to stay. But lest you think it's just boomers who are inconvenienced by millennial attitudes, let's talk about a millennial that I interviewed. The person is 25 years old, runs a global company that helps third world countries get business-to-business advertisement and that sort of thing. He was having his first meeting with his entire staff. He had been in business a year, and he had hired people virtually. They worked in various parts of the world. They were all together in a meeting in London. He no sooner had started discussing their plans for the next year that 2 young men from the Eastern Europe came up and gave him a piece of paper. It was their demands. He said, "Well, demands for what?" He said, "Well, in our culture, as soon as someone becomes a manager, we assume that they're an adversary, and they need to know our demands." And he was really floored because he had been nothing but transparent. And they said, "Furthermore, we want to know basically what you're doing to earn your money as the CEO." So he, being dedicated to transparency, spent the next 2 hours describing in detail what he does every day, all the way from making deposits in the bank to working with the accountant. This did assuage the 2 guys who had brought the demands, but interestingly enough, they didn't withdraw them. They just left the paper on the desk. They'd come back to it later if he didn't live up to what he had promised. So I think the interesting thing about this is that this whole idea of proving value and having a consumer mindset is something that's very important to understand. And regardless of the economy, what we're finding, not only with millennials but other people, they're looking to have real input into the service quality, the product, and receive value for time. It's just that millennials tend to be a little more vocal about this. Let's talk about what we call the checklist kids. The Trophy Kids Grow Up, How Millennials Are Shaking Up the Workplace is a book by Ron Alsop, who is a Wall Street Journal reporter. He makes a strong case for why millennials may have trouble, some millennials, with business ambiguity and why they ask so many questions. Once again, your role as a leader, whether you're leading people of your own generation or older generations, is to help those people adapt to sort of be professional and to get to the goals that they're needed. But one of the environmental things that has been shown for younger people, and this is not a criticism, this is just a fact, that younger people want to be right and want the roadmap to get to right, are very diligent once they receive clear directions, and are accustomed to receiving explicit directions, mainly because to pass standardized tests, many teachers now teach detailed test guides and formulaic writing exercises so you get good scores, but it doesn't do much for dealing with ambiguity. And let me go back to this final one here. Many younger people are challenged by ambiguity and how to figure out on their own the right answer. I have a number of millennials who report to me, and this is one of the challenges. They'll say, "Well, what's the right answer?" I said, "We don't know it yet, but let's go through the process of getting to the right answer." But there's been so much structure provided to them in education and whatever that it becomes difficult in the business world or any other part of your life to deal with ambiguity. And this is where people with experience become very important. It's also a fact that most millennials want to coach and want to mentor and are very open to that. So this is very positive. Now, I promised some things that are common to all generations. A study called the New Career Paradigm Study, we talked about there are several things here which, except for priorities, they're all the same regardless of generation. Quality of family life rates very highly, financial security, physical, mental, and spiritual health, satisfying work. Now keep those in mind when we talk about what are the job satisfaction kinds of things that people are looking for. Salary and benefits, so that ties in with the financial security. Job security, work-life balance or flexible work options, and finally, meaningful work or advancement opportunities. Now I might say that this is obvious, but it was a revelation because some people thought that this would differ widely by generation, but it does not. Retention factors. Why do people stay on a job? Autonomy and control over work and life. And this is not absolute autonomy, this is relative. Compensation and benefits, always. Internal entrepreneurial opportunities. It's a misconception that we think we've dispelled in our research that younger people just want a job hop. The fact is that we have found very early on in the research going back 6 or 7 years that young people will stay at an organization that gives them multiple careers within that organization. So if you have that opportunity, you're in good stead with what these young people are looking for. Positive work environment, always. Something positive for every one of the generations. Now, what does all this say about leadership style and substance? After all, this is a conference on leadership today and in the future, and we're talking about distinctions. Are we talking about distinctions that aren't really differences? Is there anything really new that millennials can bring to this? Now, I'm certainly aware that most everyone in the audience is a millennial, but I'm going to speak about you in a third person here, because as leaders, you need to step back and be objective about whatever data you're going to get. I'm going to give some very interesting data here, and I hope that you'll use it and discuss it later as to whether you think it's true for you or not. So we asked these questions at Deloitte, and with the help of the Institute for the Future, which is a Palo Alto, California-based consulting firm, we interviewed within the past 15 months a number of 20-somethings who run their own businesses and not-for-profit organizations, and also were in corporations. What would their attitudes be? And my question to them when I interviewed them was, some of you are quite critical of boomers and others who supervised you. Will you be any different when it comes down to the end of the day and you have some experience and responsibility? So the first thing we did was, what's affecting most people? Migrating jobs, outsourcing, globalization, a new competitive landscape. Millennials in particular are finding their first jobs in a period when middle management jobs are disappearing and white-collar and blue-collar jobs are both going to cheaper labor markets. So that's a pressure. A less forgiving pace of work. For most of us who have been around a while, we've seen an increasing tempo of the pace of work. There's an expectation because of technology for almost real-time reaction to a huge volume of messages. And so compared to the environment in which today's leaders learned how to manage and take care of clients or customers, this is a very difficult and different world now. Do it yourself. With the rise of social entrepreneurism, we say that business doesn't have to be as usual. Young people see DIY and entrepreneurship as reasonable options for themselves. And this ties into what I said earlier about younger people having some skepticism about larger organizations. Social utilities, you all know about these, which have come on in a storm in the last few years. YouTube, for instance, is only 3 or 4 years old. Twitter is only about 3 years old. And blogging itself is only really about 5 years old. And yet all these bring with them the possibility of better communications, and the other side, more confusion. Transparency. This is key, key, key. Our research shows that transparency by leaders is most highly valued quality a leader can possess. Transparency has a specific meaning to millennials, and it says the following 4 aspects which define it: being honest with everyone, respecting the opinions of others, respecting the time of others by being punctual to meetings — that was a surprise — and being an effective speaker. And what's the new meanings of adulthood? For many professional or youth, there's no longer a period where there's a longer period now after getting married, if they do get married and having children. So there's a great deal of time and energy now available for other causes. So let's talk about 8 characteristics that point towards how millennials intend to lead. And as I said, I hope you'll listen to this and say, is this true? Is it not true? If it's not true, why? Leadership by active attention. This is what the young man that I mentioned earlier was trying to do with his Eastern European colleagues. Young leaders flourish in an environment of active attention to their work, both its strengths and weaknesses. Survey respondents didn't express regret at not having enough attention paid to them. It's just how they have been raised and they expect it. It's not surprising, given the faster pace of work and growing number of communications channels and methods in the workplace, that young people have made attention as one of the metrics for leadership. Millennials have grown up in the middle of what has been called the attention economy, the context which is the scarcest resources and ideas or talent, but it's attention, their own attention and the attention of others that they need their time of. The people that we interviewed were keenly aware of the challenge of prioritizing what they pay attention to and how they spend their time. They also are accustomed to ongoing communications with peers and parents via text messaging and all the ways you know, and they have their own strategies for dealing with this. But they're also highly attuned to what it means to not get attention, and to them, high-quality attention from leadership, even if it's just a weekly email to a group, is a signal that they're valued. High-achieving young people that we talk to also entered the workforce having had a lot of attention from their parents. And millennials generally don't feel entitled to more attention, at least that's what they say, but they do have some understanding that there are times when attention can't be paid to them. Organizations can help young people by communicating more clearly with them about the reality of what kind of attention they should expect and why. Let's talk about transparency again. Count me in is the mantra here. Young leaders expect an open work environment. In fact, and this is interesting, we found that some of these young leaders actively dislike the paradigm of closed and proprietary. It doesn't mean they feel they have a right to every piece of information, but they are accustomed to having at the internet all this information. And for them, one quote was, "Information helps me figure out how to create more value for the organization. A lack of information feels like a barrier to more intense participation." And this can often be a sore point in organizations where traditional model runs on hierarchies and privileged information. So transparency is important increasingly to young people and to others. And young people have, these young leaders had very sensitive antennae about transparency that is not held up in real life. And now this is something I think to focus on. Transparency was viewed as silent invitation for contribution and insights from younger leaders, even if the contributions were rare. If organizations really want to nurture a new generation of leadership, they're going to have to find ways to be transparent about what is reasonable to be transparent about, unless people understand when they can't be. Here was an interesting illustrative comment by a young man who worked in marketing for a multinational corporation. He said, "Telling organizations that everyone needs to work hard to drive creative synergies and to increase shareholder value does absolutely nothing for me. It's just buzzwords. It's like a 17-link chain between what I do and actual shareholder value. I think that sort of has to be absolutely clearly defined in order for it to be motivated, people to be motivated to work, in order for anyone to understand what you're doing and where you're doing it." So he's asking for clarity and transparency. Next, searching for impact. The people we interviewed were looking to be impactful, and to know that whatever they're doing matters is probably the biggest motivator of all. Young people are willing to put their time in and pay dues, which may become a surprise to some, but they are not willing to work on tasks that seem meaningless. And so this gets into a whole issue about what is low-value work, what is high-value work, and how can entry-level positions be positioned to actually get people some interesting work that they normally wouldn't have. And here is another story. I was in California at a meeting at one of the Cal State universities, and I've been invited by the city managers who were advising a particular public administration program. Their concern was that young people were not really even getting into the public administration programs, and they wanted to explore that. So I talked about my book, and then there was a discussion. Everything was going along pretty well until a young man stood up in the back and said, "You keep talking about how there are plenty of jobs for us who have masters in public administration, but we can't get interviews. We can't get interviews because you say experience is needed. You've cut the internships, so we can't get the experience needed, but you come here and say their jobs are available." And so things got a little tense till one of the city managers said, "You know, I think I see the problem. We've defined the entry-level job at such a high level that we can't really bring in younger people." So what they were going to do was redefine the jobs so they could spread out some of the quality work and therefore have younger people actually come in with no prior experience. This is the kind of adaptation that needs to occur in the business world and in the government if we are to have jobs that people aspire to. Let's go to a comment here. This was a young person in a professional services firm. Everyone in our generation doesn't mind doing hard work as long as they see the potential and the importance of this work. They're fine doing it, but they want to know why. For example, when I'm asked to do an Excel spreadsheet, I'd like to know why. If the boss or mentor just gives ample reasons, I'm happy, but just going to say, go do the work, I'm not very motivated. The do-it-yourself approach. This is making work continuously relevant for myself, and this is all about millennials, leaders raising the bar for the entire organization in terms of the use of new media and those sorts of things to make their job interesting and to add value. There are potential conflicts between these motivations for do-it-yourself and organizational goals, but they can be kept at a minimum if leaders have a better sense of what the personal journey of the millennial is on and where the work in the current organization fits in. In other words, I'll sweep the floor if you tell me why. And as leaders, millennials are likely to be more open to people that they work with following the same approach. Let's talk about the fifth thing we found out, passion and high expectations. There's growing social pressure, according to the young people we interview, to develop a passionate relationship, their word, with their work experience, especially if they're leaders. Many millennial leaders place high demands on workplaces and on themselves. They look at work as an arena for finding and honing their passions. Their passion can be for an industry, a community, a skill, or even an experience. And money and status are definitely in there, but also they want to know what's the importance of the work. Young leaders are staying in organizations that recognize the importance of their passions, and they are willing to put in the time that's necessary to get this job done. Let me give you an example of one of the comments. My generation isn't interested in having a job. My generation is interested in pursuing terms like pursuing a passion or exploring an interest or developing a skill. They're not interested in having a job. My grandfather and my father were interested in having a job. Now, that's a pretty strong statement because I'm not sure he knew what his grandfather or father thought at their time. But it was, he said it passionately, and many of the people that we talked to felt that way. Networked leadership, sharing both risk and glory. Some young people don't want to be leaders and view the label and aspiration as a skepticism. This is a concern, I think. A few respondents were uncomfortable taking on the mantle of leadership, even as they led their own organizations. They described traditional leadership in terms of arrogance, hierarchy, and did not want to be associated with the desire to be at the top. And so you might say, well, what were they talking about? We probed further and discovered that millennials were interested in leadership, just not some of the leadership styles that they experienced. They are more concerned with maintaining group harmony than either Gen X or Boomers seem to be, and they're just now in the process of refining what it means to be a networked or shared leadership. When it comes to describing what they do as leaders amongst their peers, they often return to ideas like team motivation, collegiality, transparency, and a deep dislike for pretension. There was even an organization that had truth cards, that if you didn't feel like management was telling you the truth, you could play this card and they supposedly gave you the true answer. That was kind of an interesting viewpoint. But what are some comments? What are really young people thinking about here? The glory of leadership is no longer a perk, said a commercial game designer, largely works by herself with help. I think that the prestige is nonsense. I don't want to be a director just because it's cool to be a director. I don't even care that I'm in the credits. You don't have to give me a fancy title. It's getting to do more of what something of value that's the benefit. It's going to have that I have the resources that I can return with some value on. Now the question is that an extreme view or a typical view for the millennial generation? It's something to discuss. Guided flexibility, a sign of mutual respect. Most of the millennial leaders we interviewed did not respond strongly to the concept of flexibility because that's how they live their lives. But their views on flexibility were based on pragmatism. They were aware that most valuable contributions don't occur during conventional work hours. And they tend to blend work and play. Let me give you an example, and this is a quote. Apparently the situation was that these young people had done the work, and it was a long project, so this guy says, a guy and I stayed after work one time and we brought in guitars. We were playing Guitar Hero. We had it on the projector, and senior leadership came in and they were like, what are you guys doing? So we were just playing, and they said, great, take them home, said the boss. And so the young man said, that was fun because it was a culture building kind of thing. We were playing the guitar to relax in between doing hard work, but as he called it, the paid grouch didn't like it. So what do we have here? A boomer executive saw two millennials disrespecting the workplace, while the young people saw this as a way to relax and be productive. Who's right and who's wrong? Maybe both, maybe neither, but it's definitely this is the kind of issue that requires open discussion where we learn from each other. Finally, work-life navigation. Younger people looking very much at the styles of older executives to see if they're healthy and if they're something to be emulated. Part of what is driving millennial leaders is the acute sense of importance of taking time off. Infomania, which some of you may have heard of, which is the debilitating state caused by too much backed up information, is something that people are very concerned about. I don't think anyone definitely has as an answer. But millennials look to today's leaders as role models of self-care, and they don't not like what they see at sometimes, and this becomes an issue for them as leaders. Now, having said all this, will millennials, at least the people we talk to, be able to achieve the leadership styles we've uncovered? Time will tell, but the key concept here is intention, and that raises the odds of this leadership style happening. One successful millennial told me, if my investors, who are older boomers for the most part, learned how I'd really like to manage and lead, they wouldn't give me the money I need. So a practical perspective, but it points to the friction between generations and leadership styles. Now it's time to reflect on our journey. We've explored 4 things that won't change, what we have in common, what millennial leadership is looking for. So where are we on this journey to become leaders worth following? At this point, we need to digest this material by talking about it. So here's a parting thought and a challenge for you as participants in this important conference. Accepting the validity of the 4 things that don't change and the need for new leadership styles does not mean lowering expectations as to the quality of work product or for clients or customers. What it does mean is that we would do well to realize that millennials or Gen Xers can't be younger versions of boomers, and boomers can't be older versions of millennials or Xers. We're all products of our upbringing. Therefore, we will work most effectively if we acknowledge our differences, similarities, and partner to make the present and future someplace both of us want to be. With that in mind, I always like to quote this from something that was attributed to Mark Twain. It ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. And I think that's something that every leader's got to keep in mind. So what's my challenge to you is to acquire the key characteristics of a leader worth following. These are the 4 A's I mentioned earlier. And that's awareness that none of us has all the answers, that we may know, but what we don't know. This is something that I think key. To be an active listener, to have a mind fearlessly kept open, It doesn't mean accepting every view that comes your way. It means playing with that idea and finding out if it makes sense for you and for the people you lead. Be a lifetime learner from others is absolutely key. What's the result? The result is you become a leader whom others can rely upon for wise, trustworthy, and ethical leadership, the type of leader that we now need more than ever in our nation and our world. So I challenge you to take this information, digest it, bat it around, and rise to the occasion and learn how to be the best leaders you can possibly be, the leaders who are worth following. Thanks for listening. Yes.
At this time, we're going to open the floor for questions. And after we're going to smaller discussions. Anyone has any questions for Mr. Sweeney?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Stanton, would you say that the economic downturn has changed any of the things you told us this morning?
I think it's changed in the, right. I think what I would say is that some younger people who are who thought that they could take their time and sort of do it their way in terms of the way they behaved are having to change it. I mean, there was something in the news about interviewing at a barber shop in Seattle where the spiked hair was going and the conservative haircuts were coming in. So I think on the surface we have people looking more conventional. I'm not sure. I think this is a situation where the wrapping is changing, but the package is the same. So I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of difference other than a much heightened anxiety level. Some of the millennials that work for me were very spooked about what's going on, as we all are, and I think are more surprised than perhaps we are that there's this thing that's going backwards. But I don't think it changes the fundamental attitudes. And one of the reasons is that technology and being in contact with one another, our research shows, has really fundamentally changed how young people think about work and when it should be done and what should be done. So have you had enough? Thank you.